We're seeing demands for better accountability across the nation after the recent deaths of African Americans at the hands of police. In a powerful essay for Vanity Fair, author and journalist Jimmie Briggs calls on white Americans of good conscience and faith to not only march in solidarity with the Black community, but with each other. And Jimmie Briggs is with us now to talk about his new piece. Thanks so much for being with us. I think it's so important. Your piece is so important, and it's a conversation that needs to be had. I want to know from you, Jimmie, what has this been like for you to watch all of this unfold over the last couple of weeks, especially as a father? It's something that you write about.
Thank you, Vlad. It's really been this kind of eerie sense of a vague familiarity. I mean, we've been here before so many times, more than we can remember. So there's the familiarity, but also, as I wrote in the essay, this desperate hope for Black people, for people of color across the country, for my daughter, who's just weeks old, and hope against what history has shown us is this sort of intransigent racism and oppression of Black people. The footage, that we all seen over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, was disturbing. But at the same time, I just kept saying to myself, "We've been here before. This is familiar." Telling myself, don't allow yourself to succumb too much to the despair, to the heartache of this, because we may be facing this again in the near future.
Yeah, in fact, you point out in your piece that, you covered the Rodney King riots in LA in '92. You covered the Crown Heights riots in '91 in New York. But part of the conversation I seem to be having over and over again with people is that somehow this feels different to a lot of people. I want to ask you, what is different about this current wave of unrest that you're seeing, if any, compared to the unrest that you've covered in the past?
I think the global solidarity, for sure. After Ferguson, most notably, we saw, people across the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, chant slogans, hands up, don't shoot. We saw T-shirts emblazoned with the likeness of Michael Brown Jr., whose death at the hands of a law enforcement officer in Ferguson in 2014 spawned, global and national protest and really gave life to the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think in this case, with George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, I think the intensity of global response, I think kind of the allyship across the African diaspora and across the other minority and racially disadvantaged communities globally has been so overwhelming. This does feel different. Dare I say that? It does feel different. At the same time, I think, out of self-preservation, Black Americans, we can have hope that this is different. At the same time, I feel like we have to leave a little bit of reservation just to get through if this isn't the moment for transformation.
Yeah, think about it. I think about it this way, Jimmie. I don't know, and I want your perspective on this, right? Going back to Trayvon Martin and the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement to Ferguson, Missouri, and Michael Brown, when I was in the streets covering those demonstrations and those protests, generally speaking, the majority of the people out there were Black and brown. And now, in the wake of George Floyd, you've got prime ministers of other countries and presidents of other countries saying Black Lives Matter. You've got the assistant police commissioner of London, of the Metropolitan Police, saying Black Lives Matter. Whereas it felt to me back in Ferguson, which was only back in 2014, that this was still a movement rooted around the concerns of Black and brown people. And now you're starting to see people of all color here in the streets of New York, in Minneapolis, in Los Angeles, across America, and around the world using the similar language and saying something needs to change.
Absolutely. I think without exaggeration, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement allowed us to reach this place. I think Michael Brown Jr.'s death, and I think Trayvon Martin before him, Jordan Davis, I think the deaths that have followed since then, since 2014, when the Ferguson uprising happened, led to this moment. If you think about how many young men of color, Black and brown, have died since Michael Brown Jr.'s death. Some of those deaths were documented, some were documented, some were not documented. But how many deaths have happened at the hands of law enforcement officers, unarmed men of color? I feel like Ferguson laid the roots for what we're seeing now. And you're right, 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago now in Ferguson, it was primarily Black and brown people. I think the allyship, the participation of white people, young white people in particular, has kind of given life to this moment. And I think that it's frankly, shown white elders, white Americans, parents, grandparents, and older, that this movement, that this cause for true racial justice and dismantling of white supremacy is upon us.
When you bring up allyship, and your article kind of touches on something that I've certainly been seeing, I don't know if Vlad has, but over the past few weeks, a number of white friends of mine, white former co-workers have reached out to me on social media or texted me offering support, offering words of solidarity, and some just outright asking, can we talk about race? And depending on when I get that message, I'm more open or less open, because quite frankly, I'm kind of exhausted. I'm tired, and at times I feel a little put upon that I have to explain this. And so you kind of touch on that in the article, and I want to ask you, what do you want white friends, allies, co-workers to know when they send those little messages?
Thank you so much for that. And I'll be honest with you, to be very, very honest. I wrote the essay, and I wrote certain paragraphs in the essay with some hesitation, with some fear, that by putting my feelings, my thoughts to paper, frankly speaking, I was afraid I'd lose friends, I'd lose colleagues. I create tension among my coworkers for saying what I had been feeling my entire life. But I really felt, out of a place, with sincerity, out of a place for love and affection for them, they deserved to hear my truth. And what I wanted to say to them, and what I would say to other white allies and friends, is that, as much as I want to help guide you, help educate you, speak my truth with you, to you, it is not my responsibility to argue or explain my humanity. It is not my responsibility, nor should it be my obligation, to explain the system which is oppressed to me and my ancestors and the people who look like me, a system that you and your ancestors created. Nevertheless, as you point out, sometimes I'm ready for that conversation. Sometimes I need my silence. I need my space.
Jimmie, it's so interesting that you say that, because I've spoken to so many of my friends who are Black and brown, and who say, not only have I now become somebody's best Black friend, and so every issue that they have, they need me to explain. I'm also their psychiatrist. I'm also their sociologist. I'm also their historian. And I get that is a lot to put on somebody. But the question, of course, always arises, you can only have a conversation with somebody about these things if they understand how we got here, if they understand the history, if they understand the context of where we are and why we are here. A friend of mine, gave me an example, which I thought was really interesting, that you could be in a room at a cocktail party with a majority white crowd, and if somebody brings up the writings of Mark Twain, and you as an African-American person say, I've never read anything by Mark Twain, a lot of people would look at you and say, well, that's pretty ignorant. What kind of an education did you have? And you can yet be in that same crowd of people and say, are you familiar with Langston Hughes' Warning? Or are you familiar with The Fire Next Time? And a lot of white people would say, what's the fire next time? And so that is a clear example of how the disparity in the knowledge and understanding of race in this country exists, and how unequal that footing is between white and Black Americans.
I'm so in agreement with you. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about Langston Hughes and other writers of the Harlem Renaissance, but also those who came before them. And I feel like, and both of you know this as well as I do, it's been largely the case in this country that for those of us who are brown and Black, we grew up in public schools and private schools being educated about American history. And especially for those of us who are male, we learn, we study, we memorize, we process American history through a particular lens because our survival depends on it. We grew up as Black people not only knowing our history, hopefully, but also understanding, the larger white American history. And I think for many white Americans, understanding our journey, understanding our history, understanding the complexity of who we are with it, as a people, is something they haven't had to deal with until now. They haven't had to understand us or understand why we're angry or why we die young or why we have trauma and stress, why we have unequal health outcomes. We've always had to do that because our survival, our ability to thrive in the society has depended on that. Now, with the resurgence of books by historians living and long gone, I'm hoping that people start to understand the history that has connected us all in this very unequal, I would say schizophrenic manner.
Jimmie, we were gonna wrap this discussion up, and I was prepared to do that. But when you mentioned education, I felt that I had to jump back in and sort of hone in on that a little, because in the same conversation that I was having with a friend, I mentioned that there are problems in the way that we learn our history in this country, and I gave the example of growing up here. And Anne-Marie, I love your perspective growing up in Canada, but I was growing up here in New York City, going to New York City public schools, being educated by supposedly teachers that had master's degrees in the subject matter that they were teaching. And I will never, ever forget in 5th grade getting a lesson on evolution, and the science teacher in my 5th grade class asking a question of the students about evolution, and asking why is it that black athletes are bigger, stronger, faster, all that nonsense that you always hear. And a black kid raising his hand and saying, is it because we were slaves? And the teacher saying, yeah, and going on to do a lesson around that. And I just think to myself, like, if you did not ever seek to educate yourself beyond the lessons, and let's face it, people go on to high school, they go on to college, but a lot of the things that we learn as young children stick with us, whether we know it or not. And I just wonder, and I when you meet somebody, who says, they are not familiar with why a certain term or why a certain use of language is offensive to black people, you can understand that if you are living in this bubble where you don't interact with a lot of people, you're not out there reading books or evolving your education, you can fall into that trap.
Absolutely. I think to your point, Vladimir, I feel like we even our education obviously is racialized, not only in who's teaching students across America, but what they're teaching, the pieces of history they choose to introduce and talk with nuance.
Yeah.
Jimmie Briggs, really great talking to you. We could talk to you for a half hour more. It's a fantastic article that really, I think, taps into the feelings that many people have, particularly when you look at your children. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.